had always believed he was untouchable. At 28, he stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with broad shoulders that filled out his expensive suits perfectly. His dark hair was always styled to perfection, and his smile could charm anyone within minutes of meeting him. He worked as a senior marketing executive at a prestigious firm in downtown Chicago, drove a sleek black BMW, and lived in a luxury apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. But had a secret that he kept hidden beneath his polished exterior. He had never learned to control his temper, especially when things didn't go his way. Growing up in a household where his father solved problems with his fists, had unconsciously adopted the same destructive patterns. He had managed to keep this side of himself hidden from most people, but those closest to him had seen glimpses of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Sara Martinez was everything thought he wanted in a woman. She was 25, with long auburn hair that caught the light when she laughed, and green eyes that seemed to see right through him. She worked as a pediatric nurse at Children's Memorial Hospital, spending her days caring for sick children with a patience and gentleness that amazed everyone who knew her. Sara had grown up in a loving family where problems were solved with conversation and understanding, not violence. They had met at a charity gala 6 months earlier, had been drawn to her immediately not just by her beauty, but by the way she spoke passionately about her work with children. Sara had been charmed by his confidence and success, mistaking his controlling behavior for protectiveness. Their relationship had moved quickly, with showering her with expensive gifts and romantic gestures that swept her off her feet. The first signs of trouble had appeared 3 months into their relationship. Would become irritated when Sara spent time with her friends or worked late shifts at the hospital. He would question her about every conversation she had with male colleagues, and his jealousy would manifest in passive-aggressive comments that left Sara feeling confused and defensive. She began to notice how his jaw would tighten when she disagreed with him about even small things, like which restaurant to choose for dinner or which movie to watch. Sara's best friend, Jessica, had tried to warn her about several times. Jessica was a social worker who had seen too many relationships like this one, and she recognized the warning signs that Sara was too in love to see. During their weekly coffee meetings, Jessica would gently point out the changes she noticed in Sara's behavior. Sara had become more anxious, constantly checking her phone to respond to texts immediately, and she had started declining invitations to spend time with friends. The incident that would change everything happened on a warm Saturday evening in June. Sara had been invited to a barbecue at the home of Sara's colleague, Dr. James. James was a respected pediatric surgeon who had mentored Sara during her first year at the hospital. He was married with 2 young children, but had always been suspicious of any man who showed kindness towards Sara. The evening had started pleasantly enough, had been on his best behavior, charming Sara's colleagues with stories about his latest marketing campaigns. Sara felt proud to be with him, watching as he effortlessly commanded attention in conversations. She loved seeing this side of the confident professional who seemed to have the world at his fingertips. But as the evening progressed, began to drink more heavily than usual. Sara noticed his jokes becoming more cutting, his comments more critical of others. When Doctor pulled Sara aside to congratulate her on a difficult case she had handled that week, his mood darkened considerably. He watched from across the patio as James placed a friendly hand on Sara's shoulder while they talked, his face growing harder with each passing minute. The drive home was tense and silent. Sara tried to make light conversation about the evening, mentioning how nice it had been to see her colleagues outside of work. Responded with short, clipped answers that made it clear he was angry about something. Sara's stomach began to knot with the familiar anxiety that had become too common in their relationship. When they reached Sara's apartment, insisted on coming up with her, despite her suggestion that they both get some rest. Once inside, the mask of civility that had worn all evening finally slipped away completely. He began packing around her living room, his movements sharp and agitated. The argument started over something trivial, criticized the way Sara had laughed at Doctor's jokes during dinner, suggesting that she had been flirting with him. Sara tried to explain that James was simply a friend and colleague, someone who had been instrumental in her professional development, but wasn't interested in explanations. His voice grew louder and more accusatory with each exchange. Sara found herself backing toward the kitchen as it advanced on her, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. She had never seen him this furious before, and for the first time in their relationship, she felt genuinely afraid of what he might do. The rational part of her mind was screaming warnings, But her heart was still hopping that this was just a misunderstanding that could be resolved with the right words. Grabbed her wrist when she tried to move away from him, his fingers digging into her skin hard enough to leave marks. Sarah gasped in pain and fear, looking into his eyes and seeing a stranger staring back at her. This wasn't the charming man who had swept her off her feet or the successful professional who seemed to have everything figured out. This was someone dangerous, someone who had been hiding behind a carefully constructed facade. The physical confrontation escalated quickly from there, shoved Sarah hard against the kitchen counter when she tried to pull away from his grip. The edge of the granite countertop struck her lower back painfully, and she cried out in surprise and pain, but instead of stopping, seemed energized by her distress. He grabbed her shoulders and began shaking her, demanding that she admit she had been flirting with Dr. Sarah's nursing training kicked in, and she tried to remain calm despite the terror coursing through her body. She spoke in the same soothing tone she used with frightened children at the hospital, trying to de-escalate the situation before it got completely out of control. But was beyond reason now, lost in a rage that had been building for months beneath his polished exterior. What happened next would replay in Sarah's mind for weeks afterward. As she tried to step around to reach the phone in her living room, he grabbed her arm and spun her around with such force that she lost her balance. Sarah fell hard onto the kitchen floor, her head striking the tile with a sickening thud that echoed through the apartment. For a moment, she lay still, stunned by the impact and struggling to process what had just happened. Stood over her, breathing heavily, his hands still clenched into fists. For a brief moment, Sarah saw something like regret flicker across his features, but it was quickly replaced by a cold indifference that chilled her to the bone. She realized with crystal clarity that this was who really was beneath all the charm and success. This was the man she had been falling in love with, and the recognition of her own blindness was almost as painful as the physical assault. Sarah lay on the cold kitchen floor for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, her mind struggling to process the reality of what had just happened. The taste of blood filled her mouth where she had bitten her tongue during the fall, and a sharp pain radiated from the back of her head where it had connected with the unforgiving tile. Through the ringing in her ears, she could hear heavy breathing above her, but she couldn't bring herself to look up at his face. The apartment that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a trap. Sarah's nursing instincts began to take over, automatically assessing her injuries even as her emotional mind reeled from the shock. She could move her fingers and toes, which meant no spinal damage. Her vision was clear despite the headache building behind her eyes. But the emotional damage felt catastrophic, like something fundamental inside her had been shattered beyond repair. Finally moved, his expensive leather shoes stepping around her prone form as if she were an obstacle in his path. Sarah heard the refrigerator door open and the crack of a beer can, followed by the sound of him settling into her living room chair. The casual normalcy of these sounds in the aftermath of violence made her stomach turn. She realized he was simply going to sit there and drink beer as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just physically assaulted the woman he claimed to love. Slowly, carefully, Sarah pushed herself up from the floor. Her back ached where it had struck the counter, and her head throbbed with each heartbeat. But worse than the physical pain was the crushing weight of humiliation and self-recrimination. How had she missed the signs? How had she allowed herself to be so completely fooled by a man who could treat her with such casual cruelty? From the living room, called out in a tone that was almost conversational, "Are you going to get up and fix me something to eat? Or are you going to lie there feeling sorry for yourself all night?" The complete absence of remorse in his voice hit Sarah like a second blow. There was no apology, no recognition of wrongdoing, just an expectation that she would continue to serve him despite what he had done. Sarah pulled herself to her feet using the kitchen counter for support, her legs shaking with adrenaline and shock. She caught sight of herself in the reflection of the microwave door and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale except for a red mark on her cheek where it had scraped against the floor. But it was her eyes that shocked her most. They looked hollow, defeated in a way that reminded her of the abuse victims she had encountered in the emergency room. For the first time since the assault, anger began to burn through Sarah's shock and fear. She thought about the children she cared for, everyday, innocent souls who trusted her to protect them and advocate for them. She thought about her parents, who had raised her to believe that she deserved respect and kindness in all her relationships. She thought about Jessica's warnings and her own ignored instincts, all the red flags she had rationalized away because she was so desperate to believe in the fantasy had created. Appeared in the kitchen doorway, his beer half finished and his expression impatient. He looked her up and down with the same critical assessment he might give to a piece of equipment that wasn't functioning properly. "You look like hell," he said, not unkindly, but with the detached observation of someone commenting on the weather. "Maybe you should clean yourself up before we go to bed." The presumption in his words, that they would simply go to bed together as if this were any other night, struck Sarah like a physical blow. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of the man she thought she had known, but finding only a stranger who seemed incapable of genuine emotion or empathy. The expensive cologne she had once found attractive now smelled cloying and false, like everything else about him. "Get out," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying a strength that surprised them both. Raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting from impatience to mild amusement, as if her defiance was nothing more than a child's tantrum that would soon pass. "Don't be ridiculous," he said, moving closer to her. "You're obviously upset and not thinking clearly. Let's just go to sleep and talk about this in the morning when you've calmed down." His tone was patronizing, the same voice he might use to pacify a hysterical client or difficult colleague. But Sarah was done being managed and manipulated. "I said get out," she repeated, louder this time, backing toward the knife block on her counter. She wasn't planning to use a weapon, but the proximity to something that could defend her gave her courage. "Get out of my apartment right now, or I'm calling the police." His face darkened at the mention of law enforcement. His career, his reputation, his carefully constructed life, all of it could be destroyed if word got out about his behavior tonight. Sarah saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, the cold assessment of risk versus reward that probably guided most of his decisions. "You wouldn't dare," he said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "Do you have any idea what calling the police would do to both of us? Your colleagues would find out, your parents would find out. Everyone would know what a failure you are at choosing men." The words were designed to wound, to make her doubt herself and retreat back into compliance. But instead of breaking her down, they revealed the depth of his manipulation and cruelty. Sarah realized that everything about their relationship had been a lie, that he had been studying her weaknesses and insecurities from the very beginning, collecting ammunition to use against her when she stepped out of line. "The only failure here is thinking you were worth my time," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. She moved toward her purse, which contained her phone, keeping her eyes on as she went. "You have 30 seconds to get out before I make that call." Laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. "You think you're so tough now, but we both know you need me. Who's going to want damaged goods like you? You'll come crawling back within a week, begging me to forgive you for tonight." Sarah's fingers closed around her phone, and she began dialing 911 without breaking eye contact with. The sight of her actually following through on her threat seemed to finally penetrate his arrogance. His expression shifted from amusement to anger to something approaching panic as he realized she was serious about involving the authorities. "Fine," he snarled, heading toward the front door. "But don't expect me to come running back when you realize what a mistake this is. There are plenty of women who would appreciate what I have to offer." He paused at the door, looking back at her one last time with an expression of pure contempt. "You're nothing special, Sarah. You never were." The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the windows, leaving Sarah alone in her apartment with the silence and the lingering scent of his cologne. She stood frozen in place for several minutes, phone still in her hand, hardly daring to believe that he was really gone. When she finally moved to engage the deadbolt and security chain, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the mechanisms. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation began to fade, leaving her drained and emotionally raw. Sarah sank onto her couch, the same couch where it held her during countless movie nights, and began to cry for the first time since the assault. The tears came in great, gasping sobs that seemed to originate from somewhere deep in her chest, releasing months of accumulated stress and denial. She thought about calling Jessica, but shame held her back. Her friend had tried to warn her, had seen through his facade when Sarah herself had been blind to his true nature. How could she admit that everything Jessica had feared was true? How could she face the inevitable questions about why she had stayed, why she had ignored the signs, why she had allowed herself to become a victim? Instead, Sarah called in sick to work for the first time in over a year, knowing she couldn't face her colleagues with visible injuries and the fragile emotional state that would give away everything. She spent the rest of the night sitting in her bathroom, holding ice to her head, and studying her reflection in the mirror, trying to understand how she had become someone she didn't recognize. The next morning brought no relief from the emotional weight of what had transpired. Sarah woke on her couch, having been unable to bring herself to sleep in the bedroom where she had shared so many intimate moments with. Her neck ached from the awkward position, and the headache from hitting the floor had intensified overnight. But worse than any physical discomfort was the crushing realization that she would have to rebuild her entire sense of self from the ground up. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly throughout the morning with text messages from. At first, they were angry and accusatory, blaming her for overreacting and threatening to tell mutual friends his version of events. Then they shifted to manipulative attempts at reconciliation, with promises to change and declarations of love that rang hollow after the previous night's violence. Finally, they became desperate pleas for another chance, painting himself as a victim of his own emotions who needed her help to become a better man. Each message made Sarah feel sicker than the last. She recognized the classic pattern of abuse that she had learned about in her nursing training. The cycle of violence followed by contrition, promises, and love bombing, designed to draw the victim back into the relationship. Reading's text was like receiving a textbook demonstration of manipulative behavior, and she found herself both horrified and oddly grateful for the clarity it provided. Jessica arrived at Sarah's apartment unannounced around noon, carrying coffee and pastries from their favorite bakery. Sarah had finally worked up the courage to call her friend that morning, though she had been vague about the details of why she needed support. One look at Sarah's face was enough for Jessica to understand that her worst fears had been realized. "Oh, honey," Jessica whispered, setting down the coffee and pulling Sarah into a gentle embrace. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry this happened to you, and I'm sorry I wasn't here to prevent it." For the first time since the assault, Sarah felt safe enough to tell the complete story. Jessica listened without judgment or interruption, her professional training helping her provide the exact support Sarah needed. She validated Sarah's feelings, praised her courage in standing up to, and assured her that none of what happened was her fault. "The hardest part," Sarah admitted, curled up in an armchair with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, "is feeling like I've lost myself completely. I look in the mirror and don't recognize the woman staring back at me. How did I become someone who would tolerate being treated that way?" Jessica reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. "You didn't become someone different. You encountered someone who was very skilled at hiding his true nature and manipulating your kind heart. The fact that you trusted someone you cared about doesn't make you weak or foolish. It makes you human." They spent the afternoon developing a safety plan. Jessica helped Sarah document her injuries with photographs and encouraged her to file a police report, though she respected Sarah's decision to think about it for a few more days. They changed Sarah's locks and installed additional security measures, including a camera doorbell and reinforced door frame. Most importantly, they created a support network of friends and colleagues who could provide assistance if tried to contact her again. By evening, Sarah felt emotionally drained but more clear-headed than she had in months. The fog of confusion and self-doubt that had characterized her relationship with was finally lifting, revealing the truth of their dynamic with stark clarity. She realized that her instincts had been trying to warn her all along, the anxiety she felt when he questioned her about her day, the way she had started editing her stories to avoid his jealousy, the gradual isolation from friends and activities she enjoyed. Made one final attempt to regain control 3 days later, appearing at Sarah's workplace with an enormous bouquet of roses and a handwritten letter of apology. Doctor, who had been informed by Sarah about the situation, intercepted in the hospital lobby and made it clear that he was not welcome on the premises. The security footage of his reaction to being accessed provided Sarah with additional evidence of his true character. The letter itself was a masterpiece of manipulation, alternating between self-deprecating admissions of fault and subtle blame-shifting that made Sarah responsible for triggering his violent behavior. He claimed that his love for her had made him temporarily insane, that seeing her with other men brought out a primal protective instinct he couldn't control. The letter concluded with a threat disguised as concern for her, suggesting that she would never find another man who could love her as deeply as he did. Sarah shared the letter with Jessica and Doctor, both of whom helped her recognize the calculated nature of every word and phrase. What might have once seemed like romantic passion now revealed itself as possessive control. What he had framed as love was actually ownership. The protective instinct he claimed was nothing more than jealous rage directed at an independent woman who refused to be diminished. The healing process was slower, and more complex than Sarah had anticipated. Some days she felt strong and confident in her decision to leave. Other days she was overwhelmed by self-doubt and loneliness, questioning whether she had overreacted to what might have been an isolated incident. Therapy helped her understand the trauma bonding that had kept her connected to someone who was harmful to her. Months later, Sarah learned through mutual acquaintances that had already moved on to another relationship. The news brought a complex mix of emotions, relief that he was no longer focused on pursuing her, but also deep concern for his new girlfriend. Sarah wrestled with whether to reach out and warn the woman, ultimately deciding that unsolicited contact might do more harm than good. The experience fundamentally changed how Sarah approached relationships. She learned to trust her instincts when they warned her about someone's character, even when that person seemed perfect on paper. She developed better boundaries and communication skills, refusing to compromise her values or for the sake of keeping peace in a relationship. Most importantly, she learned that her worth was not determined by whether someone chose to treat her well. A year after the assault, Sarah met David, a fellow nurse who worked in the emergency department. Their relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on mutual respect and genuine friendship. David was patient with Sarah's healing process, understanding that trust would have to be earned gradually. He never pressured her to move faster than she was comfortable with, and he actively supported her independence and career goals. What struck Sarah most about David was his consistency. There was no charming facade hiding a darker nature underneath. His kindness was not contingent on her compliance or agreement. When they disagreed about something, he listened to her perspective and worked toward compromise rather than trying to dominate or control the conversation. He celebrated her successes without feeling threatened, and he supported her friendships without jealousy or suspicion. The contrast between David and was so stark that Sarah sometimes wondered how she had ever confused possessiveness for love. Real love, she learned, was not about ownership or control. It was about supporting each other's growth and happiness, even when that growth meant becoming more independent rather than more dependent. Sarah never saw again after that final confrontation in her apartment, though she occasionally heard updates about his life through the social circles they had once shared. He continued his pattern of intense, short-lived relationships, each following the same trajectory of love bombing, control, and eventual explosion when his partner inevitably resisted his dominance. The shame that had initially consumed Sarah gradually transformed into strength and wisdom. She became an advocate for domestic violence awareness in her workplace, helping to develop protocols for identifying and supporting abuse victims who came through the emergency department. Her personal experience, as painful as it had been, enabled her to connect with other women in ways that pure professional training never could have achieved. Years later, Sarah would reflect on that night as the moment her real life began. Not the fantasy life had created for her, full of expensive gifts and empty promises, but an authentic life built on self-respect and genuine connections with people who valued her for who she truly was. The woman who had been slammed to the ground in her own kitchen had stood up stronger than ever before, and she had never looked back.